Maybe we can go ahead and get started. It's been a little while, so a couple weeks, so let's recap where we were. What's No, the answer is that's coming today. I didn't even tell you last time what philosophy is. Yeah. Get out of here, Tertullian. Away with you. So we started even before the start of my previous talk. Really, the setup for this was Chesterton gave this great series on Pieper's book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. I talked about this distinction between the workaday world and these leisure pursuits, right? These things that are pursued for their own sake, not for utilitarian ends. And this led us into, Pieper has the second lecture that's part of this book called The Philosophical Act, which focuses in on philosophy as a specific type of activity that forms the part of this kind of culture. And so I started with two questions of, first, why philosophy? Who cares about philosophy? Why should we care about philosophy? What's the point there? And then second, this question of, should Christians do philosophy? Is this something that's a good idea for Christians to do? Is it something that Christians in general should care about? Or is it really just, the more egg-headed ones among us? Okay, so, and we also talked about some of the sources you could point to that could indicate that there could be tension between Christianity on the one hand and philosophy on the other, some passages from Scripture, some passages from the Fathers and other early patristic era writers who, suggested that, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem, right? So we talked about that. We talked about philosophy as a leisure activity in Pieper's sense. And then we talked about how philosophy kind of begins in this perplexity, right? This sort of confusion, not just confusion, right? But really these questions dawning on you in a new way, where something that you took for granted in the world suddenly seems more mysterious, seems more perplexing, right? And it's not all negative. It's not all just confusion and I guess I'll never understand this thing. It's really what the ancients described as a response of wonder, right? We want to understand this thing. We have it in front of us, and like the questions we talked about, right? We all sort of understand what justice or fairness is, but once you start to reflect on it a little bit, you might realize, wait, I don't know if I can really articulate what that actually means, right? What it actually means for something to be just. Or how do we know what's true? We all know things that are true. We all know lots of truths. But what is the criterion, I guess you could say, for how we discern between the true and the false, right? And then questions like, wait a minute, why is there something rather than nothing? This is the sort of base metaphysical question of, we have this reality before us, but it's not a given in the sense that it didn't have to be, it didn't have to exist. So why is there anything? Why is there anything at all? These are the sorts of perplexing questions that, really get philosophers all riled up, but if you reflect on them, might also strike you as important questions. We also talked about, last part of the recap here, we talked about, Pieper introduces this distinction. It's not his, but he reminds us of this distinction between really the two different dimensions of our rational nature, right? There's intellectus, and it's not mafia, Jim, it's ratio. It's ratio. These two parts being basically our capacity to understand. Pieper calls it spiritual vision. It's the way that we tap into the world in front of us, the intelligibility of that world. And then the ratio side of things is more of our discursive reasoning, our ability to sort of think through things, think hard about things, consider and weigh objections and competing claims, that sort of thing. Okay. So we were talking about all that. And we landed with these sort of, example philosophical questions like, what is justice? How do we know it's true? Why is there something rather than nothing? And I ended by saying that in a lot of ways, all of these questions are questions about metaphysics, okay? Metaphysics. Kind of a scary word, but don't worry, it's not as scary as it sounds. So why are all these questions really questions about metaphysics? What does this have to do with metaphysics? And what is metaphysics? Okay. So metaphysics is really about reality, the nature of reality. That's really what you're interested in when you're asking a metaphysical question. What is it and why, right? You're not just interested or you're not content with the fact that things are a certain way. You want to understand them. You want to understand why. You want to understand what it is. And at the end of the day, I mean, if metaphysics is about, if it's about reality itself, what more could you want? What more could you expect out of any kind of intellectual activity like this than to come closer to reality, to what's real, to being? And I said in some ways this is the most distant from our everyday world, from the you could say the workaday world, to quote Pieper. Something that's far removed from our immediate pragmatic needs, putting food on the table, getting a roof over our heads, paying our bills, etc. But for that reason, it's in a lot of ways the most fundamental thing. The most fundamental. And the reason is because reality itself is hierarchical. And we're not used to thinking about reality this way. We're used to thinking about, here's the world that I can observe, and you could take a sort of a scalpel to it and cut it down to smaller and smaller bits, and the smaller you get, the more fundamental reality you find, right? It's not molecules, it's atoms, and it's not atoms, it's protons, neutrons, and electrons, and it's not that, it's quarks, and it's not quarks, it's strings, or something like that. And we think, in our day and age, that we're getting to something more fundamental, what's more real. But it's actually, in a lot of ways, the reverse is true. It's not to denigrate any of the sort of scientific, more fine-grained scientific investigation at all. It's just to say that we have not a scientific, but a scientistic mentality where what's going to be more real and fundamental is going to be the smaller and smaller parts that make something up. Well, that's not really what metaphysics is about. Metaphysics recognizes that this world here, the one in front of us, is in many respects not as real, but for opposite reasons, because you go in the other direction, not to more and more material things, but away from the purely material, the purely contingent reality. Our world is derivative. It's secondhand in some ways. It is contingent. We talked about how, not everything exists in the same way. It's not as simple as saying, like, does something exist or not? Existence itself comes in degrees. There is a fullness of being and a less full version of being. And as Christians, we know the fullness of being, the one that sums all this up, the one who's not contingent, the one who is not derived, is God himself, and that all of the world around us only has existence in this derived sense, only because God shared his existence with the rest of creation. So rather than a kind of scientific mentality, metaphysics, we're going to be thinking about this more, you could say, platonically. So the philosopher Plato lived a few hundred years before Christ, but he kind of had this insight that the material world, the world accessible to the senses, was not the primary world. It was, in a sense, a secondary reality, something that was derived from a higher level of reality that was not changeable and mutable and contingent, but something which was fixed and necessary and eternal and had a higher mode of being. Okay. And so we can take that without agreeing with everything Plato said, because he also said some pretty crazy things too, things we would consider crazy or just unacceptable. We can take his language and his insight, and in fact, you'll see in the early centuries of the church, and even before that, even before Christ, among Jewish writers, an appropriation of some of Plato's terminology and his framework and everything in order to understand, to provide us a way of thinking about the reality that we're encountering before us. Okay, so reality, it comes in degrees. Existence comes in degrees. Not everything exists in the same way. It comes in patterns. It's intelligible. It is ordered and purposeful, the reality we see in front of us. And because it's intelligible, because it's ordered, because it's purposeful, I mean, even in a single act of perception, like if you just see that rose in the garden, already there's an order and a purpose. The fact that your perceptive faculties are able to identify this, carve out this thing that's there, like identify a thing. And it's not just a mass of sense impressions. It's an actual thing that you're able to carve out and understand because of its form, because of the nature of the rose. Already there's a kind of order and intelligibility built into how we interact with the world. And again, we don't usually think about this. We don't notice it. In fact, it would be distracting if we always thought about the world in this way, but we could take a step back and realize that this is the way we engage the world. And we want to understand the world in that way. We want to understand reality. We want to understand the what and the why. We're not content with just things are the way they are, and I guess that's just the way it is, and I never have to never reflect on it. No, these questions can strike us, and we can realize that we want to understand the what and the why. Like, what is it? What is its nature? What is the essence of this thing? What is it really, right? What is the reality? And then why? Why is it this way that it is? Okay, and so far as we're able, we want to be able to somehow define or circumscribe or put into words a way of describing what this reality is, what the nature of this thing is. And if we can't do that, if we can't, totally circumscribe something, and we very often can't, what can we say? What can we say? What are the limitations of what we can say? And if we can say that, we need to understand what those limitations are as well. So we may touch on some sort of deeper reality that is sort of lying just behind the immediate environment that we are engaging in, even if we can't grasp it entirely. We may touch it without being able to grasp. So that's sort of how I think about metaphysics. And I'm going to go through some examples now that if that sounded a little abstract, that's okay. I think it might take a little while to sink in. Let me go back to some of these examples we were talking about and see how this works with these questions, okay? So as I mentioned, there's one of these paradigmatic kind of ethical questions, like what is justice, right? You think this would be really important because lots of people have lots of different ideas about what justice is and what counts as just. So if you want to get to the heart of it, maybe if we all understood what justice was, maybe we could resolve that question, right? Whether a particular example counts as just or not. So as I mentioned, this is a paradigmatic ethical question. It's something about justice, how we relate to each other, what you owe another person, how you treat them, guides your life, etc. But already in that question, what is justice? It's a metaphysical question. It's a question about what it is. It's a question about the nature of justice. It's a question about what is it really? What is it actually? So really and you could do this with other ethical questions, but the point here is when it boils down to is all of these ethical questions are really questions about metaphysics, questions about reality, questions about what it means to be fully human, what it means to become that, right? It's something you become. You become more human. You actually step into your nature in a new way, and that's a metaphysical reality. That's a metaphysical thing, okay? For the Greeks, when they talked about ethics, most of them, they weren't content just to talk about is it okay to, do an eye, take an eye for an eye or something like that. For them, ethics was ultimately about participating in God's wisdom. This is what Plato says. This is what Aristotle says. That's really what ethics is ultimately about. It's about you entering more into a more full, matured, participating in a transcendent mode of being, really. That's really what ethics is about. It's not about trolley problems. It's not about, the episode of House where can we cut the guy open or not? No, it's nothing. It's not really about that, okay? It's about becoming more human, and it's about participating in God's own life. That's really what ethics is about. How about epistemology? So this is this area of philosophy concerned with knowledge, from the Greek word episteme, for knowledge. I mentioned an example there of how do we know what's true, right? And that's a question, that's an epistemological question. It's a question sort of about discernment, about the criterion for judging between what's true and false, right? As I mentioned, we all want to know what's true, and we don't want someone to pull the wool over our eyes, right? But as part of this, discerning what's true or not means that we're judging against a standard that's outside of ourselves, really. This is a point that St. Augustine makes in one of his early works, before he was ordained, I believe, even a work of his called On Free Choice of the Will, where he says, when we're judging competing claims, we have to appeal to a standard outside of ourselves and indeed above ourselves. We judge things below ourselves that doesn't look quite right. Gotta touch it up, fix it, right? Not enough salt, not enough garlic, things like that, right? We make judgments about things below us, or even about things on the same plane as us. We make judgments about other people, like that person's not the way they should be, right? They're not behaving, not you, Dave, not you specifically, but that person's not the way they should be. They're not acting the way they should. But when it comes to those judgments, what we're doing is we're appealing to a much higher standard, right? Something that we don't judge, but which we use to judge other things. And this, says St. Augustine, is the truth. That's what we're doing. It may sound like a, surprisingly simple answer, but the way we judge things are true is by comparing them to some standard above us, which is the truth, capital T, truth. And now, you could ask this question at this point, well, what is truth? This was Pilate's question, right? We don't have to ask it in the same spirit as Pilate when he was staring truth in the face. We can ask this question and in a more, less in a sort of challenging way and more of a, it's this question for us, right? We want to know what's true. The good news is we know the truth. We all know the truth personally, right? Christ, who said, I am the truth. We know him, right? So at the end of the day, what is epistemology really about? It's about judging between what's true and false, okay, fine, but that's really secondary. That's the derivative part of these epistemological questions, because the only way we can do that successfully is if we know the truth. If we're in contact with the truth, if we're communing with the truth, if we are open and receptive to reality, and that at the highest level of God himself. It's a kind of receptivity to being that's primary, right? You have to be open to receiving what's real and true into yourself in the first place. And if you have that, and I'm going to use this phrase again, communing with the truth, if you take it into yourself, then you'll be in a position to start judging between what's true and false. So the main takeaway here is these other questions that are, you could call ethical questions or epistemological questions in philosophy are really questions about metaphysics. It's about what's true, what's real, what exists. And then that in the perspective of what is the hierarchy of these things? What are the degrees of being? And how can we participate in that truer form of being? And, it shouldn't be too surprising that all of these things are connected. I mean, just experientially, we actually experience the world this way, believe it or not. It might sound like you were talking about something kind of abstract, but no, this is how we experience the world. At least in my case, when I sin, it makes me really stupid, right? It actually blinds me. It prevents me from understanding the truth right in front of me. So this ethical sort of concern, like am I doing the right thing, translates into an epistemological problem where I can't understand, I don't know the truth anymore. I've blinded myself. And if I'm not doing that, I'm not taking reality into myself. And if I'm not really taking what's real and true, and instead I'm lost in my own fantasy or whatever, my own delusion, then I don't know what being is. I don't know what's real. I don't know what's true. Okay. So I think that's going to be important to understand for this last bit of Pieper and what Pieper says, because you might remember, if you think back a couple weeks, what was Pieper's question when he opened up this lecture? The most meta-philosophical question there could be. What does it mean to do philosophy? And he hasn't answered that question yet. This has all been sort of set up, right? And so what I just described as I think going to be helpful for understanding what Pieper's punchline is here, right? What does it mean to do philosophy, and why is it important? So Pieper's doing this similarly through a sort of circuitous, indirect route. Okay, so he started with talking about his stuff on leisure versus the workaday world and all that stuff, and then he zigs a little bit before he zags back on course. So he asks this question, and this is, if you tried to read his lecture on this is easily the most difficult, challenging part of it. I think it's section 3 of that lecture. That's very dense. So if you tried to read it and got lost, you're not alone. It is very dense. He starts talking about biology and things like that, and you're like, what is he talking about? What does this have to do with this topic? Okay, so let me break it down. So he starts with this observation that every living thing stands in some relation to what's outside of it. And this is not meant to blow your mind. This is just a simple observation. Every living thing, be it a plant, a microorganism, a more macro level animal or a human being, we stand in some relation. We're not locked in. We're not locked in some sort of solitary box. We stand in a relation to some kind of world or environment outside of ourselves. Every living thing inhabits a world. It has a world that it lives in. But not every living thing relates to the world in the same way. And this is, again, obvious. A plant has a certain way it interacts with the world, photosynthesis and all that stuff. An animal is going to have a much more sensory-based, much more diverse and dynamic way of interacting with the environment around it. Okay, and those are obviously different ways of relating. So now he mentions that there was this 19th century biologist who was influential and kind of a pioneer in exploring this area in the realm of biology. His name was Jacob von Uexküll, and he basically made the observation that when an animal interacts with its environment, it doesn't see or perceive the whole of that environment. Rather, its perception is very limited to sort of what it's, I don't like this phrase, but kind of hardwired to pick up on. So you all know about this if you've seen Jurassic Park, right? You're not supposed to, if you stay perfectly still, it can't see you, right? So this actually happens in nature quite a lot where, like if the grasshopper's staying perfectly still and the crow is there, the crow can't see it. But the moment it moves, it can suddenly see it. And it's not a matter of like the crow just didn't notice it. It literally cannot see it if it's standing perfectly still. So its perception is limited in this way. Interesting, right? So is that true of human beings? Well, undoubtedly, right? So we have a form of this that, at least at some level, with our own limited perceptual faculties. There's only certain light frequencies we can perceive, only certain sound frequencies we can perceive. I'm colorblind, so I get even less data than a bunch of you. So, here I am thinking like peanut butter is green until I'm like 16 years old and someone finally tells me the truth. And I'm like, here I am, like not getting all the facts that I should from my perceptual faculties. Okay, but here's the question. Here's the kicker. It's a randomly specific autobiographical piece of information, I know, but it's really important for what Pieper's going to say. No. So much. Like when I walk in with like mismatching colors and everything. So then the question becomes, is man capable of more than this? Is there more? Is he able to somehow transcend the limitations of his own sensory perception and engage the world in a way that is unique within creation? And Pieper's answer is yes. This is the answer you see traditionally over, at least especially in the more classical or ancient tradition. So here's a quote from Pieper on this. We have already said that by comparison with plants, the perceptive faculty of animals brought new and more extensive powers of relating into the world. Okay, so animals interact more than plants do, have more of a relation. May we not say that the form of knowing peculiar to man, which has always been called man's power of cognition, has also introduced a new mode of relating, one from which both animal and plant organisms are barred. To this essentially new capacity for relations, there must surely correspond a field or world answering to that capacity. The answer to this question is that, in the tradition of Western philosophy, the capacity for spiritual knowledge has always been understood to mean the power of establishing relations to the whole of reality, with all things existing. Spirit, it might be said, is not only defined as incorporeal, but as the power and capacity to relate itself to the totality of being. Okay, I'm going to sit down after I tried to take that all in. Okay, so what is he saying? He's saying that an animal's perceptive ability to perceive its environment relates it to a more limited version of the world. It gives it a slice of the world, but not the whole thing. And insofar as we are also animals and have our own ability to perceive things, we're also only going to get a slice of the world from a sensory perspective. But insofar as we are spirit, insofar as we are selves, insofar as we are persons, you could say, to use some more sort of contemporary terminology, we also have the ability to come into contact with, to encounter, to take into ourselves the whole of reality. All being. Everything, the whole kit and caboodle, God and the world, Pieper sums it up as that. And that doesn't mean that we grasp all of it, it doesn't mean that we circumscribe it and we wrapped our minds around it and like we can move on to the next thing because there is no other thing to move on to. It's going to be limited, but what we have an openness to, you could say, is the totality of reality, the totality of being. Okay, so there's a couple ways you could unpack this. One is in terms of the breadth of the knowledge that we are capable of as human beings, okay? We are not limited to just parts of being. We're not limited to some just subset of reality, right? We are not limited to just the biological knowledge or just the knowledge of chemistry or just the knowledge of physics or anything like that. It's the whole of being that we're open to. And you could think about this, how this applies to how we think about education. We had a great discussion last week as part of the school meeting where people kept bringing up, like, we want to make sure all of these subjects are understood, that they all connect to each other, right? That they're not siloed away from each other, right? I can't state from my perspective what a radical difference that mentality is from what I'm used to seeing in discussions of education, where the emphasis is on increasing specialization, always on increasing specialization. You're never just an expert in, like, biology, right? You're an expert in, like, this subspecies of seahorse and their, like, dietary habits, or whatever it is, right? And so you become a specialist, and that's not a bad thing, not a bad thing at all. It's important to know about the seahorses, but what you lose if you focus so exclusively on that is you lose the whole. You lose the connectedness between all of your knowledge and all of these areas of being, all of these different dimensions of being. So what we're doing is we're kind of forcing ourselves into these little silos and these little niche areas without connecting ourselves back to the whole. And that's very much related to what Pieper's talking about here, right? One of the things he's saying is that we as human beings are capable of connecting it back to the whole and of understanding at a more, like, generalizing and understanding at this more universal level the reality in front of us and how these things all connect to each other. And this is also related to, there's this old sort of aphorism that goes back to Aristotle, but was used by, and I mean dozens and dozens of the church fathers and Christian writers throughout the centuries, where they would say the soul, the human soul, is in a certain sense all things. Man is a microcosm. He is a kind of mirror that stands and faces reality, and he sort of, like, takes it in and reflects all of reality back in himself, right? Things that are above him, both things that are above him in the more spiritual realm and things that are below him in the material realm, we take all of that into ourselves. We commune with it in a certain sense, right? Our souls become connected to and related to everything on the whole ladder and scale of being. Man is a kind of microcosm. And then also we could think about this in terms of the depth of our knowledge, not just we can know about more things than other types of animals do or something, but the depth of our knowledge, what the actual quality of that knowledge is, what it means for us to know it or understand it. And here the point is that to some degree we're able to understand the nature or essence of things. Like we get the reason for things, you could contrast this with sort of the mere conditioning of stimulus response you might see in an animal, right? I love my dog, but she doesn't get it. Like, she doesn't understand things at a certain level, right? She's even very intelligent, right? There's a lot about the world that she perceives, and she knows, like, this means that, right? She hears a car door, slam 4 blocks away. She knows an intruder is imminent, and it's the end of the world, right? So, like, she gets connections. So, but all at the same time, she doesn't ask these philosophical questions. She doesn't ask why. She doesn't try to understand what things are. It's much more limited to her environment, to the particulars in her life, her family, the people she knows, her best friends, which is everyone she meets, and the examples. The particular examples and particulars that come into her world, you could think of this as, she's content with, the way things happen to be, versus this question of, no, but why is it that? Like, why? Why is it that way? Why does it have to be that way? And this is contrast with how we engage with the world, where we look for and we grasp reasons. We look for these things. We want to understand the what and the why. And again, this is limited, although we have a spiritual half to ourselves, as it were. We're not pure spirit. We're finite, even if we touch the infinite to a certain degree. And Pieper describes this as a posture of of hope, actually, right? So he comments on this phenomenon that a lot people who study philosophy sometimes, or some of these famous philosophers, they get to a certain point in their career and they're just like, I'm so sick of doing philosophy, I thought I was going to get answers, and it turns out that I don't have the answers I was looking for. I wanted everything tied in a nice little neat box with a bow, and it was going to be the answer to the thing. And instead, they kind of become skeptical, and they say, well, it's all just a bunch of baloney because it didn't give me these hard and fast answers that I wanted. And Pieper's point is that this misses the point of philosophy. It's not that we're going to be able to comprehensively grasp these things. It's rather that in this limited way, we will participate in and engage with and encounter those, like what the real reality, what the essence of things are. And so, he mentions this passage in Aquinas where he says, Aquinas is like, I just want everyone to know, this is very much a paraphrase, but he says, I just want everyone to know that I don't want you to think that when we do this, we're going to be able to really understand a lot of this. We don't even understand the essence of a single fly. Like, that's not what our minds are really capable of doing. We're not capable really of circumscribing, grasping comprehensively the reality in front of us. The point is more that we are, again, in this position of hope of we are reaching out to this thing that is much bigger than we are and participating in it in some way, but without comprehending the whole. Okay, so now Pieper says the place where we encounter this sort of new dimension of reality, this totality of being, where is that? Is it some other world? Do we have to, leave Warrenton, Virginia behind and go fly off to the philosopher's paradise or something to go find this level of reality? No, not at all. In fact, that's not how this works. So instead, he says the place that we encounter this is in the everyday world, is in our lives, our everyday lives. These are not distinct, really, and separate spheres of reality. It's rather that things in your everyday world are questioned or examined or I'll say participated in or communed with in light of their ultimate nature, is the phrase he uses. So you could think of this as the world being charged with the glory of God, right? You could think of this as, seeing the ordinary things in a new light. But the point is your mentality has shifted. You're not just thinking about the world in front of you in a pragmatic way, sort of how this is going to help me get from, check off my to-do list for the day. It's more about what is the ultimate meaning and significance of this thing and that I'm encountering right in front of me. So how does Pieper put it? It means to experience the fact that our immediate surroundings, prescribed as they are by the aims and needs of life, not only can be, but must be broken in upon, not only once, but ever and again, by the disturbing call of the world, of the whole world, and the everlasting and essential images of things mirrored by reality. Everyday things then lose their density and solidity and their apparent finality. They can no longer be taken for granted. Things then assume a strange, new, and deeper aspect. Okay, so it's the everyday things, but they lose their apparent, we think that this is all there, we think this is final, we think this is what's ultimately of sort of, significance, the sort of pragmatic ends we have. And when our perspective shifts, we now see these things in light of their actual ultimate finality. And we don't take it for granted when we have those experiences and those moments of being caught off guard and perplexed or confused or wondering at the way things are, then these things assume a strange, new, and deeper aspect, as he calls it. Father, you have a question written on your face. No, you don't? Okay. Are you sure? Does anyone else have any questions not written on their faces? Okay. So what I'd like to share now is, this wasn't originally in my notes, but yesterday we commemorated the feast of St. John of Damascus, great theologian and saint in the early church, who defended the practice of iconography and its relationship to the incarnation. But St. John of Damascus, he was also kind of a compiler of knowledge. Like, some of the books he wrote were essentially encyclopedias. And he even started the books with this statement that, I don't want to say anything original in these books. I just want to compile what all of the like the wisdom that I've received, essentially, and I want to present it in a format to you. And so the third part of the book is the one people are most familiar with. It's called An Exact Exposition of the Orthodox Faith. People have sometimes heard of that book. The middle book there is about heresies, and he's sort of like cataloging the hundreds of heresies that he's heard about before. But the first part is called Philosophical Chapters. And it's basically a 100-page commentary on Aristotle's categories. It's not even broader than that. It's just a very long commentary on this pretty, dense text about philosophical logic. But when he starts the book, he's not into the deep end yet. He's waxing a bit more poetic, and it's really nice, and you should check it out. But I wanted to share a quote from him about philosophy and what it is. Because think about how Pieper just described philosophy, and now listen to what St. John of Damascus says about this. Philosophy is the knowledge of things which are insofar as they are. That is, a knowledge of the nature of things which have being. Again, philosophy is knowledge of both divine and human things. That is to say, of things both visible and invisible. Think about that, material and spiritual. Again, philosophy is the study of death, whether this be voluntary or natural. The one, natural death, being the separation of the soul from the body, whereas the other, voluntary death, is the voluntary one by which we disdain this present life and aspire to that which is to come. Again, philosophy is making oneself like God. How? In wisdom, which is to say, in the true knowledge of the good. Again, philosophy is the art of arts and the science of sciences. Think about that unity of all the knowledge in our education. And again, philosophy is the love of wisdom, but true wisdom is God. Therefore, the true philosophy is the love of God. There's so much in there that mirrors and reflects everything we've been talking about in one way or another, right? I mean, philosophy, as you probably know, literally means the love of wisdom. Philosophia means the love of wisdom. And true wisdom is God. We know wisdom. We know the wisdom of God. He's our friend, right? As Father Patrick says, he's our friend. We know him and we love him. And so the true philosophy is the love of God. But it's connected to these other areas we've been talking about, you're not looking at just some slice of reality. You're thinking about being insofar as it is being, insofar as it is reality or true. You're looking at the ultimate nature of things. It's a participation in divine wisdom. It's not just human, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not just, people sitting around and sort of like thinking out loud or something, right? I mean, it's not human. It's not ultimately the human attempt at whatever our articulation of that is. It's really about the participation in God's wisdom, right? It's a kind of separation from the present life and a participation in the life to come, in the eternal. And it's a seeking after wisdom. Not that we think we can like get wisdom and like tie it down and bring it along with us or anything, right? This is God's wisdom. This is divine wisdom. This is something that we have this posture of hope toward, right? We participate in it without acquiring the whole thing for ourselves. And I like that description of wisdom as knowledge of the good, because we don't really use the word wise or wisdom very much in our sort of colloquial language, right? We don't usually say like, oh, that person is wise. It sound like you have some, guru on a mountain or something, right? I mean, that's not, the word wisdom was used much more frequently, but maybe what we say more commonly nowadays is like knowing best. Maybe that's a good way to summarize it. Knowing best. Knowing what's really good. Knowing best. Okay. So to bring back to Pieper. Well, first, any comments on that? Any thoughts on that quote from St. John? Anything that struck you?
What you were just saying, little thoughts, and this came up last week, and Pieper talks about, if you like to speak, putting ourselves in a position of perception.
Yeah.
And posture to see. And yet that doesn't eliminate our sort of the synergy of us sort of chasing after. But I thought of the prodigal son, and it's often pointed out that the son took one step in repentance towards the father, but it was really the father who came running out to the son.
Mm-hmm.
So our measure of going after wisdom is relative to wisdom coming after us. But they're still,
Yes.
they're both still working together.
Yes. I like that comparison of that image, because I think you're right that 99% of it will be receptive And the rest of it that us trying to untangle and work through things and articulate things in our very imperfect and finite language will be that 1%, and our search, our striving after that wisdom.
One more thing.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's really important, and the reason I wanted you to talk about this in the context of this culture class is that the things that you're talking about are, you have an education in this, and you learn, a bunch of $10 words and everything, and people might think philosophy is for eggheads, and you've already addressed that, but it's really important for people to understand that we are all, this is for all human beings, that
Yes.
is what makes us a human being, that we are lovers of God and of wisdom and of the truth, and we can live a philosophical life at every level. You don't have to be an academic. You can be a ditch digger. And, there's a lot of folk wisdom. So you don't need all the $10 words.
So you're stealing all of my next bullet points, actually, which is great. That's the next point. You're absolutely right. And I didn't actually mean to interrupt you, you should keep going because that's the next question is sort of like, okay, so that's Pieper's vision for what philosophy is. And then it's this question of, is it just for this arcane academic study you go to, and what you'd find in a typical many universities, probably the majority of them, does not reflect this vision of philosophy at all. Most departments, philosophy departments around the world are going to be focused on basically just thinking hard about some traditionally philosophical problem and dissecting it down to that quantum level, basically. And there's no broader appreciation for any of the things we've been talking about here whatsoever. And I'm going to talk about that too in a second, because you will find that in some schools which are trying to capture something of the original ancient spirit of what the point of philosophy was. But you won't find that in most academic circles. And then beyond that, is it something that is for the ditch diggers? Yes, it is. So how? How is the question. Or what does that mean, right? So, it is this sort of, we were talking about the receptivity, a sort of contemplative stance toward God, right? The ultimate reality that we want to be taking in is God himself into ourselves. And as, the ancient philosophers acknowledged, doing that sort of activity, that contemplative activity, explicitly, directly contemplative activity, is not possible to do all the time. You can't just lock yourself in your room and contemplate, because we do have practical demands on ourselves, right? But at the same time, they saw the ability to take to engage in this in a leisurely way, right, where we're stepping away from those immediate pragmatic needs as something. Aristotle called it divine. Aquinas called it superhuman, above human, because that's what we're doing. We're shooting for something that is beyond, as human beings, we're ordered to something that's more than just human, right? And it's not possible to finish this, as I mentioned. It's something that's lovingly sought but never fully possessed. Okay, so how do you participate in this? So there are these cases where you can step away, and there is this more purposeful contemplative activity, and this could be happening in the context of prayer, worship, the office. These are all ways, these things that stand at the center of the whole ring of concentric circles are those things which take us away from the more immediately pragmatic, in a way, and focus us just on loving adoration of God, right? And there's a lot we could unpack here, too, about what this has to do with, rationality and the logos. This idea of a reasonable service, a rational worship, right, that Paul talks about, that's in the Roman canon as well, where it says, make this sacrifice reasonable. Make it reasonable. What does that mean, right? Make it reasonable. But it's all connected to this. And then, but when we step away from that, what does that look like? Well, first of all, that everyday life, when you go back to digging the ditches or whatever it is, it needs to be fueled stem from that contemplative activity, that more or less philosophical type of activity, right? As Pieper has described it. It's something which can manifest itself in your interactions in the development of virtuous habits and how you interact with people. I mean, this was very much in the ancients' mind as well when they saw this contemplative activity as connected to your behavior, right? And your development of these virtues of things like courage and temperance and even justice, which they counted as one of the virtues, friendship as a virtue, how you lovingly relate to another person and connect to that person, commune with that person. And another thing that the ancients noted here, and then I'll mention, is that beauty is really important here. This is something that gets glossed over a lot in translations of some older ethical texts, but when the ancients talked about what made an actual action virtuous, their answer was that it was a beautiful action. And they didn't mean that in some sort of superficial cosmetic sense. They meant that the pieces came together into this harmonious and beautiful whole in your actual activity. And the result of doing that would be that your soul would get reconfigured. Because what's the problem? The ancients knew this. What's the main problem? That your soul's all out of whack. It's all out of alignment. You've got one part fighting against the other part. Your anger is rising up against the better part of you that knows what's good and true. Your appetites are doing the same thing. And so when you actually participate in beauty through your actions, you reconfigure your soul and make it itself beautiful. They would describe things in this way. And it gets glossed over because people translate it as like this word for beauty as good. It's just good. This thinner, much tamer, moral-sounding word of good. No, they were talking about you becoming something beautiful. Okay, and so ultimately, you can apply this same logic to your occupation, the ditch digging, the doing laundry, the cleaning up dinner, right? I mean, all of this becomes part of this ordered whole that stems from this, that is rooted in, you could say, this non-pragmatic activity, but which then gives life to everything else that you're doing that's just the humdrum, right? The ordinary toil. Is there anything you want to add to that in terms of?
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
About Peter's book. Maybe I just missed it, which is like that. When I wrote critique, and like I said, maybe I missed it. I didn't feel like he did a great job of communicating that the sacramental possibility of work. Like he was making such a strong point.
Right.
That it's sort of like so heavy-handed.
Right.
On that side.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
then, the Greeks in terms of the elite class, and I talk about this in the first lectures here, the elite class of leisure, and we want to defend that, actually. We're giving an apology for that.
Yes.
But I do think there's a danger in missing the sacramentality of work.
Yeah.
The Jewish model is different because the great Jewish philosophers, religious philosophers, the ones who were engaged in leisure, they all had a trade. It's a very different. They weren't pitted against one another. Paul being a tent maker was completely aligned with the Jewish model. So, I mean, personally, this is personal for me. It's not an abstraction. Like my model and my heroes are the craftsman philosopher, the farmer philosopher. And so anyway, that's
no, it's several. Yeah.
There's one thing I walked away from this book.
Yeah.
I feel like
And I agree with that. I think rhetorically what he's doing is he has to posture himself against this overweening sort of work world, right, where that is emphasizing so much, and so you want to come back on the other end and be like, well, like what? So the work is, like, what's the value of work then? Is it just kind of this necessary evil that you got to get away from? You might walk away with that impression from Pieper, and yes. Yes. Yeah.
I think about obviously the Mass is at the center of, complete and not, there's nothing utilitarian about it. It's just total, sacrificial. It's a holocaust. Everything's burned up. They're just offered. But especially something that's even visually, aesthetically, says that probably louder than anything's benediction. It's so powerful. So, Monday morning you need to go to the office and, do your computer programming. What keeps your head on straight about what's what is kneeling in front of the Blessed Sacrament for 10 minutes on Saturday night.
Yeah.
That's what changes that's what enables you to dig in your ditch into a sacrament in the presence of God.
Yes. Yes, and this is an important point about where, so we look to these ancient philosophers and like St. John of Damascus say, there's quite a bit of good stuff here. We need to bring this into our way of seeing things. But this is a really crucial limitation, and in fact, almost an aberration in their way of thinking about things, that they, for them, this wasn't something, for most of them at least, most of the schools of philosophy, this wasn't something that was done by the mass of enslaved humanity living in and around the city of Athens. This wasn't something for them. They didn't get to do, because their lives are meaningless and worthless in their eyes. They're subhuman practically. So one of the things that I think Christ brings us is that the whole of human nature is ennobled in this way. And it is now for the little children as much as it is for the guy sitting in the ivory tower, writing about philosophy 10 hours a day. That love of wisdom and communing with wisdom is for the infant who comes and communes at the altar rail. That's them doing this in the Christian mode. And I agree that I don't think Pieper draws that out in the way he might. Yes, I agree. I would assume he believes that. He's grounded in a lot of great stuff. So I would assume he believes that too. But yes, rhetorically, I think he's kind of pushing back on this world of work, and it gets you away from the guy whose 90% of his life is going to be the toil. Yeah. Okay. So next week will be the last installment of this, and we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to start by talking a little bit about some other things that Father Patrick mentioned a moment ago, but we're going to start with this question of so that's sort of the classical vision for philosophy. Where does modern philosophy begin? It begins in a very different place. It begins basically with two things: doubt rather than wonder. Rather than wondering at the world, it begins with doubt and skepticism. Is that really true? And secondly, it begins with this insatiable desire to control the world around us, to become, as Descartes put it, the masters and possessors of nature. And that all of modern philosophy stems from these two things. And it's all variants on that exact same theme. And this is a diametrically opposed vision of that receptivity toward being, which does not possess, does not grasp, does not try to own, and toward that philosophical spirit that begins in wonder. And then Pieper closes by talking about the importance of tradition, how no one philosophizes in a vacuum. There is no such thing as pure reason, as this purely disconnected rational activity. We always philosophize within a tradition. And by the way, in our modern world, whether we like it or not, that tradition is going to be Christianity, either the acceptance of it or the rejection of it. It's pretty interesting. And then we're going to close the whole series with talking a little bit with a bit more concreteness about how has the church appropriated philosophy historically. Like, what are some ways that this has been done? And a few different ways this has been done. I mentioned St. John of Damascus writing a whole book on philosophy as a predecessor, but there's other things that have been done. So we'll talk about all of that next time. And see you then. Have a good week.